Fans of Monty Python will recognize this music as that show's opening tune. But composer John Philip Sousa originally wrote this march for a very different occasion: the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893. In an extraordinary feat of engineering, a temporary white city arose on the shores of Lake Michigan in less than 2 years. The largest buildings that had ever been built honored what were considered the pinnacle of human achievement: mines, electricity, machinery, agriculture, and manufacturing. And with last-minute cleanup still underway, President Cleveland opened the event on May 1st, 1893, by clicking a button that started the event's electricity. The centerpiece attraction, in an attempt to out-Eiffel the Eiffel Tower, was the world's first Ferris wheel. Illinois native George Ferris designed it, 250 feet in diameter, carrying nearly 2,200 people at a time. There has never been a larger Ferris wheel since. Nearly 28 million people attended the exposition. It was truly the event that dominated American cultural life around the turn of that century. Novelist Hamlin Garland wrote home to his parents, "Sell the cook stove if necessary and come, you must see the fair." Of those nearly 28 million visitors, hardly any were allowed to photograph what they saw. Canadian-born architectural photographer Charles Dudley Arnold was appointed as the exposition's official photographer, granted exclusive monopoly rights to reproduce and distribute his images. After fierce protests from both the press and the amateur photography community, led by photographer Alfred Stieglitz, that initial stance was revised. But the regulations imposed instead were deliberately cumbersome. Daily license fees at 4 times the entrance fees, only small hand cameras permitted, no plates larger than 4 by 5 inches, no tripods, and no photography inside the exposition buildings. This photography policy, in effect, prescribed the stories that could be told about the event, not just then, but also now, over a century later. Control over physical space is control over images of that space, and control over images of that space is control over memory. The images Arnold controlled became the official record. We have numerous pristine prints of that official utopian vision. Everything outside that monopoly slipped into a different category. Technically public domain, but not necessarily publicly accessible. Who owns an image, and therefore who owns the past, was the question the exposition itself could not escape. The question of who owned an image was very much live in the air at that moment. The U.S. International Copyright Act of 1891 had only recently extended limited protection to some foreign rights holders. The exposition hosted an entire auxiliary congress on patents, trademarks, and copyright. The Librarian of Congress and Register of Copyrights, Ainsworth Rand Spofford, was invited to lecture. On July 11th, he presented his paper, Practical Workings of the Copyright Law. 5 weeks after this lecture, his office received what we now know as the first attempt to register motion pictures for copyright. Somewhere in that context, one question remains. Was Edison's kinetoscope, the motion picture viewer, actually present at the fair? Film historians have debated it for decades. And what is arguably more fascinating than determining whether the machine was there is the difficulty of analyzing that question from my contemporary vantage point. My focus has been on the Electricity Building, where in the upstairs gallery, Edison had an overview exhibition of the North American Phonograph Company. This exhibit would have included the kinetoscope. One of the main reasons we think it was there was that it was announced everywhere. Multiple sources before and during the fair claimed to have seen it, but none of those descriptions quite matched the actual machine. The reasons for thinking it was not there are more compelling. Edison's project lead, W.K.L. Dixon, was sent to Florida in early 1893 to recover from what was then called brain exhaustion. This set the machine's development back by at least 2 months. Edison himself was quoted, "I was very anxious to have one on exhibition at the fair, but we will not have it finished in time." And most decisively, there is a letter from the exposition's Ways and Means Committee acknowledging Edison surrendering his kinetoscope concession in Chicago. So why has the rumor persisted? The Archives of American Art at the Smithsonian Institution houses part of the archive of Edison's most staunch revisionist historian, Gordon Hendricks. In an audio recording of a lecture Hendricks gave in 1962, he claims that there was one kinetoscope in Chicago. After its initial showing in Brooklyn in May, the machine would have traveled to Chicago, where it would have been placed in the Electricity Building. This piqued my interest. Known for his obsessive research skills, Hendricks did not tend to make claims like that without 2 pieces of evidence to back them up. One kinetoscope in that massive Electricity Building was a nugget of a research path I was willing to entertain. For an entire summer, I trailed through Hendricks's archive. I found a note from 1956, an enlargement of what he described as an object to the left of the Edison electric tower. But as I looked closer, I realized the object was one of Ottoma Anschutz's electrical wonders, an entirely different machine. I looked and looked and looked. I trailed through thousands of images from 20 institutions, in person and online. I concluded that images of the upstairs gallery of the Electricity Building are incredibly rare, and images of the phonograph exhibition are nearly non-existent. I kept asking myself, where is the line between existing, surviving, and available? And when do you know you have looked long and hard enough for evidence of a thing that might not have been present? And then one day at Harvard's Houghton Library, a letter from Spofford himself saying he had bronchitis and wasn't at the fair at all. I had built a story around the presence. I had been constructing a connection between Spofford lecturing at the fair and the first copyright registration for motion pictures, and it rested on a shaky foundation. The official sources say one thing. The more personal, unpublished sources corrected me. This is not a failure of the research. This is what research is, a repeated, necessary surrender to uncertainty. What could be salvaged? Edison was at the fair. We know he saw Anschutz's electrical wonders. And Anschutz, as a foreign national, had never protected his work in the US. When Dixon sent Edison's film work in for registration that August, it coincided with Edison's being at the fair. The evidence that does survive still suggests the exposition may have been the spark. Spofford just wasn't the one who lit it. A humbler story, but a more honest one. I do not know when I have looked long and hard enough. Perhaps I should have stopped there with a humbler story. But then, one day, I came across an 8x10-inch glass plate negative in the Hammer collection at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. William Hammer was a consulting electrical engineer, assistant to Edison, and Edison's appointed representative at the fair. This plate is an anomaly. It is clearly larger than the permitted 4x5 inches. It was clearly taken inside an exposition building, explicitly forbidden. Someone was able to do everything the policy said they couldn't. This perhaps speaks to the power that Hammer, via Edison, was able to wield. now catalogued simply as number 91, Columbian Exposition, Electricity Building, 1893. There is no record of when it was taken or by whom. Faced with one of the only primary sources of that upstairs gallery, all I can do is sit there and let it speak to me. And every time I look again, I see more. I see numerical indications of which exhibition is which, and I can compare those numbers with the official catalogues. I see people staring back at me. I see a guard who has partially erased himself, seemingly keeping an eye on the person taking this photograph. I see a curtain, and I realize I will never be able to see what kind of magic is taking place behind it. In the deep layers of the image, mostly phonographs. But in one corner, something else, a different shape. Could this be the one elusive kinetoscope that might have been present? But I just cannot tell. I am frustrated at my inability to penetrate the world of 1893. I am forced to stay on my side of the line that divides me from it. What good is it that I know my way around so well in a building and exhibition that do not exist anymore? The impenetrable layers in the image of this material glass negative represent the perhaps equally impenetrable historical layers of ideologies and policies embedded within it. It is unlikely the kinetoscope was present at the fair. Perhaps the rumor has persisted because if the machine could have made a splashing debut anywhere, it would have been there. But that is only apparent in light of what we now know cinema became. In 1893, nobody knew that yet. The movies were not inevitable. They were just one promising technology among many, in a building full of promising technologies. The White City was not meant to last. Painted white to resemble marble, its neoclassical facades were covered with a cheap mixture of plaster, cement, and hemp called staff. After the buildings were packed up and abandoned, most of them burned down the following summer. Nearly 28 million people had passed through. The largest buildings ever built, gone in a flash. What survived was not an accident. It was a decision made in 1893 by a photography policy, by a monopoly, and by the power of some people over the space that others simply moved through. Arnold's pristine official prints survive everywhere, while the hammer plate is simply number 91. Who holds the physical material still controls who gets to look. A strict policy extended across time. In the long exposure photographs of the fair, people erased themselves simply by being alive and moving. It is the ones who stood still who remain visible to us. History works the same way. The only way I get to tell a story at all is by having these images be existing, surviving, and accessible. And any discussion of what history can say next needs to start there.